Hello and welcome to Different Conversations, where every week we have a different colleague from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Westminster, talking about their work, their research, their life, and what's interesting at the moment. This week, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome my good friend, my colleague, and technically speaking, my office mate, Professor Louise Thomas. Louise, how's it going today?
Oh, it's very good. Thanks, Brad. It's nice to be here.
It is. It's good to be here. It's an incredibly hot day. But before we even get into the podcast stuff, I have my feet in a bucket of hot water because of you. Sorry, excuse me, a bucket of cold water because of you.
Well, I hope it's cold.
What's going on here?
I find this is, actually, when we were in the office, because you couldn't open the windows, I found the only way to stay cold is to have a bucket of cold water under the desk, which cooled it down. I've started doing it at home, and it really does help. I feel much better for work.
Because for the sake of clarity, it's 35 degrees today. It's one of these heat wave in London days we're experiencing at the moment. We're both sitting in small rooms recording. I've got all doors and windows shut. I've got a giant light right here, and I feel fantastic. And I'm willing to admit that we actually stopped recording. I ran and found a washing up bucket and stuck my feet in cold water. And I feel so much better thanks to you and a story about duck physiology that we're going to have to talk about another day. But brilliant. So yeah. It's the first time I've ever done a recording with my feet in a bucket of water. First time.
See, and nobody can see on camera, so you're fine.
So just to get away from my damp toes, perhaps apart from duck physiology, you could give a little bit of background about who you are and what your research is about. All
right. So my research, actually, I've been in research quite a long time now. It feels like a lifetime ago. I started at the Hammersmith Hospital, and I've always been quite interested in why you can have two very similar people who have completely different metabolic outcomes. And the way I've researched that over the years is using magnetic resonance imaging, where we scan people and look at their body composition in detail. So we call it precision phenotyping. So when I started, I was very interested in visceral fats. So you could have two identical people who had same age, gender, ethnicity, BMI even, but had very, very different metabolic outcomes. You could have one with type 2 diabetes and one with completely normal glucose control. And when we imaged them in depth, we found out that differences related to the level of visceral fat. And then as time went on, we built the number of methods we could use, and we were able to measure how much fat people stored inside their muscles and how much fat they stored in their liver and then last of all their pancreas. And what we found, it was storing of fat in these places caused massive metabolic differences. And that's really what's driven my research for the past 20 plus years, as to understanding why people deposit fat differently and what can we do about it.
So just for people listening who maybe aren't sure, visceral fat, what's that? Is that different to the fat that I'm thinking of that I can kind of find quite easily on myself at the moment, unfortunately?
Yes, that's right. Sorry. So the visceral fat is the fat inside your abdomen. So it's not so the fat underneath your skin is your subcutaneous fat. And then the fat you have around your liver, your kidneys on the inside, sort of swishing around your intestines, that is your visceral fat, or some people call it intra-abdominal fat. And that's the fat that puts you at particular risk of metabolic disease, and the fat we're very interested in measuring.
Okay, so that makes sense. So the visceral fat tends to be worse for you in terms of metabolism.
It does.
So I was reading only a couple of days ago, the government of Canada has just released, the Canadian Medical Association, Obesity Canada, Canadian Association of Bariatric Physicians and Surgeons has put up this big statement saying that obesity shouldn't be defined as someone's fatness or their size. That's inappropriate now, but I'm going to read the exact quote. But obesity should be defined as whether a person's body fat impairs their health. So I was interested in your take on that, because that seems to align very closely with what you're saying.
It does, actually, because body fat but fat has had a bad press over the years. People now kind of equate fat as being something that's bad. If you went back into kind of medieval times and medieval art, fat was something to be celebrated. It was a sign of beauty. And it's only in kind of from the 90s onwards we became transfixed with this, skinniness equates to beauty. But we've also got this transfix in our brains that skinniness translates to health. And that really isn't true, because I mean, we and others have done studies looking at the fat fit phenomena. And you can have people who, from conventional BMI scales, you would classify as obese or even morbidly obese, but they're actually fit. And if you look at their fat distribution, they tend to store the fat on the outside of the body, subcutaneous fat, and very little on the inside as either visceral fat or liver fat. And as such, they're healthy. So if you were judging somebody on their looks, you would classify them as unhealthy, but that simply isn't true.
That's really interesting. I guess both of us being life scientists, both of us love these things called biomarkers, a thing that you can easily measure that then kind of associates or relates to health in some way. And BMI and even how much of your body was fat are two easy ones, aren't they? But perhaps there's more accurate ones, I guess is what you're saying. And that could be visceral or liver or...
Exactly. I mean, the BMI, as you well know, is just a simple ratio of your weight to your height squared. And on a population level, it tends to be very informative about things like risk or mortality. But on an individual level, it gives you next to no information. So, I mean, but we've known this for a long, long time. If you go back to the Second World War, lots of American footballers who had a very high muscle mass tended to fail the draft to be conscripted into the army based on their BMI alone. So we've always known that BMI doesn't really tell you much about body composition. And it's difficult to measure the factors we're interested in, things like visceral fat directly, without using something like MRI, which is a very expensive technique that most people don't have access to.
Yeah, because that's kind of the obvious next question. If we're coming along and saying, well, this visceral fat measure is better as a marker of health or lack of health than total body fat, well, we can measure total body fat, we can measure BMI, we can measure body composition relatively easily. So how can people find out their visceral fat or try and measure it in some useful way?
It's not easy. I think the best proxy and is something like waist circumference. Waist circumference does correlate, again, on a population level with visceral fat level. On an individual level, again, waist circumference isn't that good, but it'll give you a better indication than using something like BMI. So there are predictive equations where you can take factors like your BMI and your waist circumference, your age, your gender, and put them in and come out with an approximate. And there are some methods, like some of the newer impedance machines come out with proxy measures of visceral fat. But if you want to measure accurately, you have to use the gold standard like MRI imaging.
And for people who haven't been in an MRI machine before, they're quite an experience. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of cost, and it's a very claustrophobic little tube. So I get your argument. It's not ideal for the average person or the frequent measurement, is it?
No. But for if you want to do a clinical trial or a weight loss study and you want to see where the fat, so if you're trying to design the best possible intervention to lose that fat that is most adverse for you, you would need to use something like MRI.
And so if we bring this back towards home, towards the United Kingdom, one of the reasons I was so eager to have you on as a world expert in fat and fat distribution, Professor of Metabolic Health, by the way. Congratulations. Again, I forgot to mention at the start.
Thank you
recently
very
appointed
much.
Professor. We've had Boris Johnson talking a lot about, I'm going to use, quote, war on obesity as his line on this. Is this message too simplistic, or is it a good message that's understandable to people, if you know what I mean?
I do. It's very difficult. It's very provocative terminology, things like the war on fat. And I think there's too often been the perception that people who are overweight or obese are not losing weight because they're not trying hard enough, or they're not making an effort and it's their fault. And I think this has been in the public domain and within the media and even within science for far too long. I mean, overweight and obesity are really complex, multifactorial issues. There are so many reasons why people are overweight and find it difficult to lose weight. And I think unless they have a better understanding than that, a simple argument that let's have a war on fat isn't going to help.
I don't think I can do an interview at the moment without talking about COVID-19, sorry. So to drag that back to COVID-19, which seems to be the only thing we can talk about these days, there's been a real association with severity, with risk of mortality in COVID-19, with metabolic syndrome and with obesity. Now, I'm not aware of any research on this, so I'm going to throw it to you, but do you think visceral fat measures might correlate better than just simple fat with severity of outcome with something like COVID-19?
It's funny enough, I have seen a paper in press that suggests that, but as you say, there's been very limited information. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there are lots of MRI scanning centres who would be doing the kind of research measuring visceral fat just aren't running at the moment. So there's kind of a hold on human research in lots of institutions. But yeah, there's now overwhelming information like linking obesity in general with COVID-19. And, you know, if you think about obesity, it puts us in an inflammatory state, and our ability to fight infectious diseases and all the other complications are made much worse. I mean, it's really interesting because I think when COVID first came out, and we thought of it purely as like a lung condition with pneumonia, and you know, we were assuming all the at-risk groups would be people with sort of asthma and lung disease. And now we're finding out it's type 2 diabetes and obesity. It's a very different disease now than it was probably in January.
Yeah, I guess our understanding it's evolved quite quickly. We had David Gaze on a couple of weeks ago, and he made some very interesting observations about how different populations have responded in terms of the side effect of the inflammatory load of the disease, where you had, completely off topic of what we're talking about, but now I just want to mention it because it was interesting, where you had more respiratory side effects in populations where smoking was much more prevalent. And in populations where obesity and metabolic syndrome are more prevalent, we're seeing much more cardiovascular events. So on the topic of visceral fats, your group was very closely associated with some of the early work to do with people with different body compositions having different metabolic profiles and outcomes. And when I was doing research on this, I came across the term toffee. And I'm not a massive fan of toffee personally. I find it quite chewy, but I know that's not what we're talking about here. So what are we talking about here? Well,
toffee actually has quite a funny history. And the reason we first identified it, which I think is quite a good message for students starting out in science, was at the time I had a real obsession with plotting graphs. So instead of coming up with like bar charts with like little error bars, I had a program called Unistat, which made these beautiful dot plots. And when we plotted the data, and you divided people up into lean, overweight, obese groups, found that there was this massive overlap between the ranges. So you had lean women with as much, if not more, visceral fat than some of our overweight, obese, and even a couple of morbidly obese subjects, so people with a BMI over 40. Then we replicated this in men, and we had this really interesting phenomenon of lean people who had more visceral fat than very obese people. And the reverse was true. We had some very, very obese subjects who had very little visceral fat. And we described it at the time in a very catchy way of lean people with a disproportional amount of intra-abdominal fat, which was really going nowhere. But at the time we worked quite near the BBC, and reporters would often come and want to have their fat scanned. And we would scan them, they would film and say, wow, you've got loads of visceral fat, or not, as the case would be. And as this gained interest, we had a chap from The Observer came, and he had his fat written. And he immediately turned our very long mouthful to describe this into, oh, toffee, these are people who are thin on the outside and fat on the inside, which is where it took off. And it was like, when he said it was kind of so obvious, but I think it's the reason why he was in the media and we were in science. But yeah, it's kind of taken a life of its own. It has its own little Wikipedia page and in comedy sketches. So it's very interesting. So we've been very interested in identifying people with toffee, and they have a very particular metabolic risk.
I think if you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to make sure to mention those two things. You have a research topic that became a Wikipedia page. I think that's really cool, but also became an incredibly viral comedy video by, I think it was an Irish stand-up comedian. And I can't remember the name, so we'll find the link for it. But
The first time I saw it being referred to, like popular things on television, I was really surprised. It's like you never really imagine. You always hope your work will have an impact in science, and and with the area I'm in sort of medical or clinical work, you never really imagine it going out into the public and having a life of its own without you. It's a bit strange, really.
I'm definitely linking the video that I'm thinking of. I can't remember the name of the comedian, but she is hilarious, and the clip is hilarious. And it was inspired by many hours, many years, I'm sure, staring at MRI screens.
Oh, yes. Well, that was the problem. In those days, we had to analyze everything manually. So it would be like one day solid analysis per person to get the numbers out. So things have changed now, thank goodness.
You've given me like just the perfect segue. So thank you for that. Because I do research like that. I do research on a person or two people at a time. And you've mentioned in the old days, we used to spend a whole day analyzing single MRIs, but you don't do a lot of that anymore, do you?
No, the advent of the UK Biobank changed our world. So I was at the Hammersmith Hospital. I was part of an MRC group there for probably about 20 years. And in that time, we probably scanned about 3,000 individuals. So they would have been in interventions. So maybe some people got scanned several times, but it gives you an idea of how long it took us to acquire a very large database. And then the UK Biobank was born, and they developed an imaging arm. So 100,000 people are being imaged as part of the UK Biobank to study sort of middle-aged disease in the UK. And within a few weeks, they had accumulated as much data as we had. I mean, they now scanned over 40,000 people. It's an extraordinary resource. So, and I mean, there's not just the MRI, there's huge amounts of data. There's lifestyle information, genetics, blood information, and it's freely available for all bona fide researchers to use. And it's really revolutionized the way we do science, because we couldn't analyze 40,000 scans manually. If you turn that into man hours, I think if I was doing it on my own, it would take me hundreds of years. So our group and others, to be fair, have developed automated methods of analyzing data. And we've got a really exciting partnership with a commercial company where we're using machine learning. So we take like a batch of data we manually annotate, so it's expertly done by people who really know what we're doing. And that's put into a machine learning system, which then learns how to analyze the data and spits out the results. And I have to be honest, I was completely skeptical when we started this, because I thought, no way can a machine ever do what we do, because it takes too much prior knowledge. And over the years, I've tried to train people to analyze images, and you need a particular mindset of attention to detail, which is quite difficult to find. So I was a complete skeptic, and when we started seeing the results and QCing them, I have been amazed. We're working with a very, very good team at the University of Westminster. We've got Jimmy Bell, Brandon Witcher, and Nicholas Basti, and yeah, it has been fantastic. We're now in the position, whereas it would have taken me a day to measure how much visceral fat and subcutaneous fat somebody had. And within a matter of minutes, we can not only measure how much fat they have or where they have, we can measure all of the abdominal organs and come out with volume measurements. It's and all different health metrics can be derived from that. It's really exciting work.
This is coming at it from a completely different point of view. Like, did you expect at any point in your life up until it happened to be doing AI-driven research?
Well, it's been a natural evolution, because we have been working with, as you say, commercial companies for a long time. And initially, it was mostly pharmaceutical companies. We've done lots of kind of clinical trials, drug trials. And then we started working in the very early days of the UK Biobank with companies interested in developing methods for measuring fat. I think some of these partnerships on paper look surprising, but and it's really important, because one of the issues with running these data analysis is lots of universities just don't have the computer resources to be able to run things, the kind of data set sizes we now have, without paying significant amounts of money for access to cloud storage. So working with companies who've got the resources to do this kind of work and really move the science on much more quickly.
The working on scale, on data of this scale, must bring up just completely different challenges than we're used to having to deal with. And you mentioned them already, with computational stuff. But what else do we have to worry about?
Yeah, I found this, I sometimes feel like I learned all the wrong subjects at school to be useful to me now. Because in the advent of big data, you can't use the kind of spreadsheets we've grown up at. Like a standard UK Biobank spreadsheet of my data, I can't open it on my PC. You need to be able to use programming languages. So I need to be able to do analysis in R, ideally on a cloud. And it's something I found quite frustrating, because I just did not have a background in programming. So now I'm faced at my great old age of having to learn to do these new things to keep. But I mean, I'm very lucky. I work with a great team who do have these skills in-house. It's not that we can't get on with the work. It's just that I can't do it all myself anymore.
Yeah, I don't think you should try and do it all yourself. I mean, we are egotistical in academia, but please don't attempt that. We'd miss you when it all went horribly wrong.
I think it's always, yes, it's always the worry of letting go. But yeah, I have done so now.
It does continue to amaze me sometimes that approximately half of the optimal health, or the Research Centre for Optimal Health where you work, quite a number of them are actually just pure programmers, basically.
Yeah, I mean, they're brilliant. I mean, Nick's actually got a background in image processing, and Brandon is kind of on the closest thing to a polymath I know. He's come from industry, he's worked in imaging, he's a statistician originally. So he has like the perfect skill set for the kind of work we do.
Cool. I like that analogy of this idea of people coming together. So I'm going to make sure we never tell Brandon we call them a polymath, because, you know.
Well, I think that the area of research I've always worked in has always required multidisciplinary work. So when I started many years ago at Hammersmith, there were teams. So there were teams of physicists and engineers. There were the medics and clinicians, and then there were people like Jimmy and myself, the biochemists. And it was that combination of people who had sufficient skills for clinical MR studies.
Yeah, I think there's something there that people often forget about. The sciences is so much of it is methodology driven, I guess, for lack of a better way. It's not incredibly shiny, beautiful, expensive machines. It's literally building something, wiring it, making it, like your engineers and physicists, and saying, okay, does this work? What about this? Occasionally setting fire to things, just seeing what happens as we go.
That makes it, the early days when we first started scanning, most of our equipment was built in-house, which meant it also got fixed in-house. So I remember, myself and other people would be in the scanner, something wasn't working, an engineer would come and try and solder it while you were there, things sparking away. So it was always very exciting. But yeah, and I think that kind of multidisciplinary collaborative style of working is what's made our team quite successful.
So we've alluded to it, and one of the things I wanted to mention, just to make sure we name checked it, Research Centre for Optimal Health. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's right.
Optimal Health is a funny name. So
it's funny. So when we moved to Westminster and we're developing a new unit, Jimmy and I discussed this at length. So Jimmy is very interested in optimal health, because the idea is that, you might have, so you might be born and then you might say now you die at 80, and that is your lifespan. But you might become ill from 50. And then your years between 50 and 80 are of poor health. And so Jimmy sees a real differentiation between a health span and a lifespan. And what he's interested in is ideally shifting that as far as possible, so you're healthier as long as possible. So staying in a state of optimal health, which isn't absence of disease, is a state of optimal health where all of your organs and your mitochondria and everything else in the body are functioning to its best.
Because that's exactly the point I wanted to raise. If you've got like a point where we are now, then you can measure disease. And of course, a lot of traditional life sciences research is focused on being how sick are you? And then your group, your center, comes at it from a different point of view, saying how healthy are you? Where I'm guessing most of us fall over here. So how do you measure how healthy someone is?
It's actually much more difficult than measuring disease. But you can look at things like, ideally, you have to find people who are healthy and measure things within them. I mean, defining health isn't that easy, because we traditionally define health as an absence of disease, but that doesn't mean you're healthy. You could be in a pre-disease state for many years, and traditionally health isn't something that we measure. But you can look at mitochondrial function in cellular systems. We've got very nice, seahorse machine that looks at mitochondrial dynamics in real time. So there are ways of measuring it. I mean, we've done studies when we very first started looking at liver. It was very difficult to know where to draw the line between healthy and disease. So we scanned everybody. We scanned athletes, we scanned ballet dancers, we had Olympic athletes, we had everybody we knew basically came in, and we were trying to demarcate what was healthy and what was unhealthy to come up with cutoffs to define populations. But these things tend to be very big, because you need to look at this at a population level, which takes time and money.
So if anyone out there is listening, then please send all checks to.
That would be nice.
One day it'll work. I try.
Yes, I try. Well, we're sending in lots of grants at the moment, so hopefully they'll work if the checks don't come.
Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. It only really remains for me to say thank you, Dr. Professor now Louise Thomas, newly appointed, from the Research Centre in Optimal Health, for joining us today. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, feel free to check out some of our earlier works or subscribe, either if you're watching us on YouTube or listening in on audio channels, be it iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or whichever service you use to subscribe to. My name's Brad Elliott, and this has been Different Conversations.